All right, let's take a trip back in time to Austria in the 1920s. Imagine the aftermath of World War I, with the Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolving, leaving Austria to figure out how to move forward. It was a time of political turmoil, economic struggles, and a bit of cultural chaos. But at the same time, it was also a time of innovation, intellectual breakthroughs, and a cultural scene like no other. So, let's dive into the heart of it, the economy. If you thought the 1920s were all about jazz and flapper dresses, Austria was living in a different kind of reality. After the collapse of the empire, Austria's economy was in shambles. They were dealing with inflation, unemployment, and the ripple effects of losing a massive chunk of territory and people. The Treaty of Saint-Germain in 1919 had sealed the deal. Austria was a tiny republic now, with a fraction of the power it once had. The country was heavily dependent on agriculture and industry. Manufacturing like textiles and machinery was a big deal. Austria had some steel industries in places like Linz, and they exported chemicals, textiles, and food. But it wasn't easy. They were importing more than they were exporting, creating a negative trade balance. The mid-1920s saw a little bit of a recovery, but the end of the decade? Well, that's when the Great Depression hit, making things worse than ever. But here's where it gets interesting: innovation. Despite the rough economic conditions, Austria wasn't just sitting around. Vienna, the cultural heart of the country, was thriving in the intellectual and artistic departments. Engineers were pushing the boundaries in electrical machinery, while Austrian architects were diving into the modernist movement, focusing on functionality and fresh design principles. Vienna wasn't just about physical innovation, though. It was also the birthplace of revolutionary ideas in psychology. Think Sigmund Freud. Yeah, the guy who pretty much invented psychoanalysis. And the city was a hotbed for philosophers, writers, and artists, shaping Europe's post-war cultural landscape. Politically, though, a mess. Austria was trying to build a republic after centuries of empire, but the 1920s were far from stable. The Social Democratic Workers' Party, SDAP, was trying to hold things together, but the political scene was divided. You had conservatives, monarchists, and these rising nationalist movements, all pushing for power in their own way. The country was practically a powder keg, with frequent strikes, violent clashes, and political groups like the Heimwehr, an Austrian paramilitary group, growing more influential. And while Austria was trying to get its footing, the rise of fascism and Nazism across Europe had a huge influence on its politics. Nationalism was in the air, and as tensions escalated, you started seeing more political violence. The question of Austria's future and its position in Europe was really up in the air. Speaking of violence, let's talk about warfare, armory, and weapons. Now, Austria wasn't exactly gearing up for another world war in the 1920s. The Treaty of Saint-Germain had stripped the country of a lot of its military might, so they didn't have a massive army or anything. What they did have was small arms and some basic artillery, but that didn't stop the country from being embroiled in political violence. Street battles between rival factions became all too common. The rise of paramilitary groups like Heimwehr and the growing influence of Austrian Nazis set the stage for the chaotic 1930s. On the social front, things weren't much easier. People were struggling. Inflation, unemployment, and poverty were widespread, and much of the population, especially in rural areas, was suffering. Meanwhile, in Vienna, you had a cultural explosion happening. The city was this dynamic hub for intellectuals, artists, and musicians, but the economic struggle was real. There was this stark divide between the rich city life and the rural poverty outside of Vienna's limits. Tensions ran high, with political divisions intensifying. It was the perfect storm for unrest. But despite the hardships, Austria did make strides in welfare and healthcare. The country had one of the most advanced healthcare systems in Europe at the time, focused on public health and preventative care. They also introduced social welfare reforms, like unemployment benefits and pensions. Still, not everyone had access to these services, especially in the working class, and quality of life was uneven. People in Vienna were living relatively well, but if you were in the countryside, things were tough. Austria, post-Austro-Hungarian Empire, was also a patchwork of ethnicities. Most people were ethnically Austrian, German-speaking, while minorities like Czechs, Hungarians, and Croats lived in the country too. The 1920s were a time of rising nationalist movements, and ethnic tensions started to flare up. Anti-Semitism was on the rise as well, heavily influenced by Nazi ideology spreading across Europe. So, while Austria was trying to rebuild itself, its minorities were fighting for recognition, and discrimination was common. Now, let's talk about the key players in all this madness. Austria had its fair share of political leaders trying to navigate this storm. Chancellor Karl Renner helped set up the Austrian Republic after the empire crumbled, and later, Engelbert Dollfuss would rise to power, leading Austria into more authoritarian rule. These men would play major roles in shaping the country's future. In the cultural and intellectual world, figures like Sigmund Freud were shaping not just Austria, but the entire world's understanding of the human mind. Writers like Stefan Zweig and Arthur Schnitzler were delving into the complexities of the human condition, and composers like Gustav Mahler and Arnold Schoenberg were taking classical music in completely new directions. Vienna's cafes were the place to be if you wanted to rub elbows with some of the brightest minds of the time. But behind all the cultural flair and intellectual genius, Austria was also a place of tension and division. The political and social strife reached a boiling point in the 1927 July Revolt, a violent protest driven by economic frustration and labor unrest. It was a reminder that while Vienna was a city of artistic brilliance, much of Austria was still grappling with the realities of post-war economic recovery. If we take a step back and think about Austria's image during this time, there were a few stereotypes that stuck. Austrians were often seen as reserved, orderly, and deeply tied to their traditions, especially their Catholic roots. But they were also viewed as fiercely independent and proud of their heritage. And, of course, there was that classic stereotype of Austrian stubbornness, a national pride and resistance to foreign influence, particularly from Germany. In terms of folklore, Austria was rich with myths, legends, and ghost stories, especially in the rural Alps. Tales of spirits, haunted places, and mystical creatures like Krampus, this terrifying figure associated with Christmas, were a big part of the cultural fabric, passed down through generations. So, there you have it, Austria in the 1920s. It was a country in transition, trying to rebuild after the war while facing political, economic, and social turmoil. Yet, it was also a time of incredible cultural and intellectual growth. The 1920s were a defining period in Austria's history, laying the groundwork for the dramatic events of the 1930s and beyond. Wouldn't you say it was a pretty wild decade? Thanks for tuning in to The World as We Know It and joining me in another chapter of world history. As always, there are more detailed notes in the description, and we welcome any requests or recommendations in the comments section. If you found this video helpful, entertaining, or educational, please consider liking this video and subscribing to support our channel. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.